Picture this, a lavish wedding in Dallas, Texas. 300 guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits, crystal chandeliers casting golden light over tables draped in silk. The bride, Victoria Sterling, resplendent in a $20,000 dress, stands beside her billionaire groom, Richard Blackwood, during what should be the happiest moment of her life. But across the reception hall, she spots something that makes her blood boil. A young woman in a simple off-the-rack dress from Target, quietly eating her dinner at a corner table. Victoria doesn't recognize her, but she knows she doesn't belong among Dallas's elite. What happens next will be recorded on dozens of phones and shared millions of times across social media, but the real shock isn't the bride's explosive reaction. It's the truth about who that young woman really is. Because in that single moment when Victoria thought she was humiliating a nobody, she was actually destroying the secret daughter of her own husband, and the fallout would ruin everything she had worked so hard to build. Before we explore what really happened at that wedding, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, to understand how this wedding became a social media nightmare that ended a marriage and exposed a billionaire's hidden past, we need to go back to the beginning and meet the three people whose lives collided in the most spectacular way possible. Victoria Sterling wasn't born into wealth, but she was determined to marry into it. At 28, she was everything Dallas high society admired: beautiful, charming, and ruthlessly ambitious. She had spent 5 years climbing the social ladder, attending charity galas and exclusive country club events, until she caught the attention of Richard Blackwood. Victoria saw Richard not just as a man, but as a golden ticket to the life she'd always dreamed of. She quit her job as a marketing coordinator the moment they got engaged, dedicating herself full-time to planning the perfect wedding and preparing to become the perfect billionaire's wife. Richard Blackwood, at 52, was Texas's third richest man, having built his fortune through oil investments and real estate development. He was charming, generous with his money, and had a reputation as a devoted philanthropist. But Richard had something that Victoria never knew about: a complicated past that included relationships and decisions he preferred to keep buried. 25 years earlier, long before he became a billionaire, Richard had been a struggling young entrepreneur who made choices that would come back to haunt him at the worst possible moment. The young woman in the Target dress was Emma Martinez, 24 years old, a graduate student studying social work at the University of Texas at Austin. Emma lived modestly on student loans and part-time work at a local community center. She drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, shared an apartment with 2 roommates, and had never owned anything that cost more than a few $100s. What made Emma different from every other person at that wedding was something no one could see by looking at her. She carried a secret that could change everything, including her own life, in ways she never anticipated. The wedding began like a fairy tale. St. Matthew's Cathedral in Dallas was transformed into something out of a magazine, with white roses cascading from every surface and an orchestra playing classical music as guests took their seats. Victoria walked down the aisle in her custom Vera Wang gown, confident that every detail was perfect and every eye was on her. The ceremony itself went flawlessly, with Richard speaking his vows in a voice that carried across the cathedral, and Victoria beaming as photographers captured every moment for the society pages. But even during the ceremony, careful observers might have noticed something unusual. Among the sea of designer suits and expensive jewelry sat a young woman who clearly didn't belong in this world. Emma Martinez sat in the back row, wearing a simple navy dress that probably cost less than most guests spent on their shoes. She watched the ceremony quietly, her face showing an emotion that was hard to read, part sadness, part longing, and something else that looked almost like recognition. Victoria first noticed Emma during the cocktail hour at the reception. As she moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and posing for photos, Victoria's trained eye immediately spotted the girl who didn't fit. In a room full of people wearing Rolex watches and carrying Louis Vuitton purses, Emma stood out like a weed in a garden of roses. Victoria whispered to her maid of honor, asking who had invited the girl in the cheap dress, but no one seemed to know who she was or how she'd gotten an invitation. As the evening progressed, Victoria's irritation grew. She had spent months crafting the perfect guest list, making sure only Dallas's most influential families were invited. Every person in that room was supposed to enhance her image as Mrs. Richard Blackwood, but this unknown girl was ruining the carefully curated atmosphere. Victoria watched Emma throughout dinner, growing more agitated as she noticed how the young woman seemed to be studying Richard, watching his every move with an intensity that felt inappropriate. The tension reached its breaking point during the cake-cutting ceremony. Victoria and Richard stood at the center of the room, surrounded by photographers and guests holding champagne glasses. The 5-tier cake, created by Dallas's most exclusive bakery, was a work of art that had cost more than most people's monthly salary. As they posed with the silver knife, Victoria happened to glance across the room and saw Emma standing near the back, watching them with tears in her eyes. Something about those tears infuriated Victoria. This was supposed to be her perfect moment, her triumph as the new Mrs. Blackwood, and this stranger was watching with an expression of such raw emotion that it felt like an intrusion into her private joy. Victoria's carefully maintained composure cracked, and she made a decision that would haunt her forever. Without thinking about consequences or cameras, she scooped up a handful of cake and strode across the room toward Emma. What happened next was captured on at least 30 cell phone cameras and would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms within hours. Victoria Sterling, in her $20,000 wedding dress, marched across the reception hall like a woman possessed. Her target was Emma Martinez, who was standing near the wall, trying to be invisible among the wealthy guests who towered over her in their designer heels and jewelry. Emma saw Victoria coming but didn't move. She stood frozen, perhaps unable to believe that the bride was actually approaching her, or maybe resigned to whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Victoria stopped directly in front of Emma, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room as she spoke words that would destroy her own marriage. "I don't know who you think you are or how you got into my wedding, but you clearly don't belong here. Maybe this will help you remember your place." With that, Victoria smashed the handful of wedding cake directly into Emma's face. The white frosting and delicate flowers splattered across Emma's simple dress and dripped onto the marble floor. The room erupted in gasps, nervous laughter, and the clicking of camera phones as guests scrambled to document the shocking scene. Emma stood perfectly still, cake dripping from her face, tears mixing with the frosting as 300 of Dallas's elite watched her humiliation. But Emma's reaction was not what anyone expected. Instead of running away or fighting back, she looked directly at Victoria and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried across the silent room. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mrs. Blackwood. I never meant to upset anyone by being here. I just wanted to see my father get married." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode, but their full impact wasn't immediately understood by everyone in the room. Victoria laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the cathedral ceiling. "Your father? What kind of game are you playing? Security needs to escort this delusional girl out before she causes any more disruption." But as Victoria spoke, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Richard had gone completely white, standing frozen beside their ruined wedding cake, staring at Emma with an expression of absolute horror. The guests began to murmur among themselves, some starting to understand what was happening, while others remained confused. Emma reached into her small purse and pulled out something that made Richard take a step backward. An envelope, old and worn, with his name written on the outside in handwriting he clearly recognized. Emma's voice was steadier now as she continued, 24 years ago, you loved my mother, Maria Martinez. You told her you weren't ready for marriage or children, so she raised me alone. She died 6 months ago, but before she passed, she gave me this letter and told me who my father really was." The silence in the room was deafening. Victoria looked back and forth between Emma and Richard, beginning to understand that her perfect wedding had just become her worst nightmare. Emma held up the letter, her voice growing stronger as she spoke to the room full of strangers who had just witnessed her humiliation. "I didn't come here to cause trouble or to ask for anything. I just wanted to see the man who gave me life, even if he never wanted to be part of it. I never expected to be welcomed, but I never expected to be treated with such cruelty either." Richard finally found his voice, but what he said next would end his marriage before it had truly begun. "Emma," he whispered, the name carrying across the silent room like a confession. "Oh God, Emma, I'm so sorry. You look just like your mother did when she was your age." With those words, Richard Blackwood confirmed what Emma had claimed and destroyed Victoria's fairy tale in the process. If you were Emma, standing there covered in cake while 300 strangers realized you were the secret daughter of a billionaire, how do you think you would have felt? Can you imagine the humiliation, the pain, but also maybe the validation of finally being acknowledged by the father who abandoned you before you were even born? The aftermath of Victoria's public humiliation of Emma Martinez unfolded like a slow-motion car crash that continued for weeks after the wedding. Within hours of the cake incident, videos were circulating on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok under hashtags like "Research on Wedding Shame" and "Isa Billionaire Secret." The story was picked up by gossip blogs, then mainstream media, and finally international news outlets fascinated by the story of a bride who unknowingly destroyed her own marriage by attacking her husband's secret daughter. Victoria's immediate reaction was to deny everything and demand that Richard explain himself. Back in their honeymoon suite at the Four Seasons, still in her wedding dress but now stained with cake, Victoria screamed at her new husband while he sat on the bed looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "You're telling me you knew that girl was going to be at our wedding? You invited your illegitimate daughter to watch you marry me? How could you do this to me? How could you humiliate me in front of everyone we know?" But Richard's response wasn't what Victoria expected. He hadn't known Emma would be at the wedding. In fact, he hadn't known Emma existed until 6 months earlier when he received a letter from Maria Martinez, his former girlfriend from his struggling years before he became wealthy. Maria had written to inform him that she was dying of cancer and that their daughter, whom she had raised alone for 24 years, knew nothing about her father's identity. Maria begged Richard not to contact Emma, saying she had built a good life and didn't need the complications that would come from being connected to a man like him. Richard had honored Maria's wishes and never reached out to Emma, but he had hired a private investigator to quietly monitor her life from a distance. He learned that Emma was a stellar student, working her way through graduate school while volunteering at a community center that helped underprivileged children. She was everything Richard could have hoped for in a daughter: kind, intelligent, and determined to make a difference in the world despite growing up with limited resources. The mystery of how Emma had gotten an invitation to the wedding was solved when Richard's assistant, Jennifer Walsh, came forward with a confession that added another layer of complexity to the story. Jennifer had been Richard's assistant for 15 years and knew about his investigation into Emma's life. She had watched Richard struggle with the knowledge that he had a daughter he couldn't acknowledge, and she had seen how the guilt was eating away at him. Without Richard's knowledge, Jennifer had added Emma's name to the guest list, hoping that seeing his daughter happy and successful might give Richard some peace. Emma's presence at the wedding wasn't an attempt to disrupt or make demands. According to Jennifer's later interviews with reporters, Emma had called Richard's office 3 times, asking if there had been a mistake with the invitation. She couldn't understand why she would be invited to a billionaire's wedding and was afraid it was some kind of cruel joke. Jennifer had convinced her to attend, telling her it would be a beautiful event and that she deserved to see how the other half lived. The media frenzy that followed the wedding was unlike anything Dallas society had ever experienced. Reporters camped outside Richard's office building and Victoria's favorite shopping centers. Emma's modest apartment in Austin became a circus, with photographers trying to capture images of the billionaire's secret daughter. The contrast between the two women became a social media obsession. Victoria, who had married into wealth and privilege, being compared to Emma, who had earned everything through hard work and determination. Emma handled the media attention with a grace that made Victoria look even worse by comparison. She gave one interview to a local Austin news station, speaking quietly about growing up without a father and her mother's strength in raising her alone. She never asked Richard for money or recognition, saying she simply wanted him to know she existed and that she had turned out okay despite his absence. Her dignity in the face of public humiliation made her a sympathetic figure and turned Victoria into the villain of the story. The investigation into Richard's past revealed other secrets that further damaged his reputation. Business associates came forward to discuss Richard's pattern of abandoning relationships when they became complicated. A former business partner revealed that Richard had once fired an employee who was struggling with a sick child because he didn't want personal problems affecting the workplace. The image of Richard as a generous philanthropist began to crumble as people realized his charity work was more about tax benefits and social status than genuine compassion. Victoria found herself isolated even among her own social circle. Friends who had envied her marriage to a billionaire now whispered about her cruelty in humiliating an innocent young woman. The video of her smearing cake in Emma's face was being used as an example of everything wrong with wealthy privilege and entitlement. Society columnists who had once praised Victoria's style and grace now wrote about her lack of class and basic human decency. 3 weeks after the wedding disaster, just as the media attention was beginning to die down, Emma Martinez made a decision that shocked everyone involved. She reached out to Richard directly, not through lawyers or intermediaries, but with a simple phone call to his office asking if they could meet for coffee. Richard agreed immediately, desperate for a chance to apologize and explain himself to the daughter he had never known. They met at a small cafe in Austin, far from the Dallas social scene that had been dissecting their story for weeks. Emma arrived first, wearing jeans and a University of Texas sweatshirt, looking like any other graduate student grabbing coffee between classes. Richard walked in wearing a business suit that probably cost more than Emma's monthly rent, but for the first time since becoming wealthy, he felt like the inferior person in the room. Their conversation lasted 3 hours and changed both of their lives in ways neither had anticipated. Emma began by telling Richard about her mother, Maria, who had worked 2 jobs to put Emma through school and had never spoken a harsh word about the father who had abandoned them. Maria had told Emma that her father was a good man who had been honest about not being ready for family responsibilities, and she had raised Emma to understand that sometimes people make difficult choices that don't reflect their character. Richard broke down as Emma spoke, realizing that he had missed 24 years with a daughter who was remarkable in every way that mattered. Emma was pursuing her master's degree in social work with a focus on helping children in foster care, inspired by her own experience of growing up without a father figure. She had never expected anything from Richard, but she was curious about him as a person rather than as the billionaire he had become. But the real revelation came when Emma shared something that neither Richard nor Victoria had known. Emma had not attended the wedding to meet her father or cause any kind of scene. She had gone because she was writing her master's thesis on wealth inequality in America, and she wanted to observe how the extremely wealthy celebrated important life events. She had planned to sit quietly in the back, take notes for her research, and leave without speaking to anyone. Emma's thesis, which she shared with Richard during their coffee meeting, was a devastating critique of how wealth concentration affected social relationships and community bonds. She had spent months researching Richard's business practices, his charitable giving, and his social circle, painting a picture of a man who had gained financial success at the cost of meaningful human connections. The wedding was supposed to be the final observation in her study, but Victoria's attack had turned Emma from an observer into an unwilling participant in the story she was documenting. The most shocking revelation came when Emma showed Richard a letter she had never intended to give him, a final message from her mother, Maria, written during her last days in the hospital. In the letter, Maria revealed that she had kept track of Richard's success over the years and was proud that the father of her child had built such an impressive life. But she also wrote that she was concerned about the man he had become, someone who seemed to have lost the compassion and warmth she had loved when they were young. Maria's letter contained a request that stunned Richard. She asked Emma to reach out to her father not for money or acknowledgement, but to remind him of the person he used to be. Maria believed that meeting Emma might help Richard reconnect with the values and dreams that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. She wanted her daughter to be a bridge between the struggling young man Richard had been and the wealthy but lonely man he had become. Richard realized that Emma's presence at his wedding hadn't been about disrupting his marriage or claiming a place in his wealthy world. She had come as an observer, studying the life her father had built, and had left as the catalyst for examining what that life had cost him. Victoria's cruel reaction had exposed not just Emma's identity, but the fundamental emptiness of the social world Richard had spent decades trying to join. The twist that no one saw coming was that Emma didn't want Richard's money or his social status. What she offered him was something far more valuable, the chance to become the father and the man he should have been all along. But accepting that offer would require Richard to make choices that would change everything about the life he had built, including his marriage to Victoria. The final chapter of this story began 6 weeks after the wedding, when Richard Blackwood made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He called a press conference to publicly acknowledge Emma as his daughter and announced that he was dissolving the Blackwood Foundation to create a new charitable organization focused on supporting single mothers and children from low-income families. Emma would serve as the foundation's director, and Richard would fund it with half of his personal fortune. Victoria's reaction to Richard's decision was swift and brutal. She filed for divorce within days, claiming that Richard had deliberately hidden his daughter's existence to defraud her into marriage under false pretenses. Her divorce attorney painted her as the victim of a cruel deception, arguing that Richard had allowed her to be humiliated on social media while knowing the truth about Emma's identity. Victoria demanded half of Richard's remaining wealth and a settlement that would maintain her lifestyle indefinitely. But the divorce proceedings revealed another layer of the story that cast Victoria in an even worse light. Richard's legal team discovered that Victoria had known about Emma for months before the wedding. She had found the letter from Maria Martinez in Richard's home office and had hired her own private investigator to learn about Emma's background. Victoria's attack on Emma hadn't been a spontaneous act of jealousy. It had been a calculated attempt to publicly humiliate the girl and establish dominance over what she saw as a threat to her position. The evidence showed that Victoria had actually encouraged Richard's assistant to invite Emma to the wedding, hoping to create a situation where she could demonstrate her power and superiority. Victoria had planned to embarrass Emma in a more subtle way, perhaps by having security escort her out, or by making pointed comments about inappropriate guests. But when she saw Emma watching Richard with obvious emotion during the cake cutting, Victoria's carefully planned cruelty escalated into the public assault that destroyed her own reputation. Emma's response to learning about Victoria's premeditation was characteristic of her grace throughout the entire ordeal. In a statement released through the new foundation, Emma said she felt sorry for Victoria, understanding that insecurity and fear had driven her to such extreme actions. Emma announced that she would not be seeking any relationship with the media or Dallas society, preferring to focus on her work helping vulnerable children and families. The media coverage of Richard's transformation was extensive and largely positive. Business journalists wrote about the unprecedented decision of a billionaire to give away such a significant portion of his wealth while he was still young enough to rebuild it. Social commentators praised Emma's influence on her father and her refusal to be corrupted by sudden access to extreme wealth. The contrast between Emma's dignity and Victoria's vindictiveness became a case study in character and values. Richard's relationship with Emma developed slowly but genuinely over the following months. They met for coffee every Tuesday, talking about everything from Emma's research to Richard's childhood dreams of being a teacher before he discovered business. Richard learned that Emma had grown up poor but rich in love and community support, while Emma discovered that her father had gained wealth but lost connection to the things that truly mattered. The Blackwood Martinez Foundation, as it came to be known, became one of the most effective charitable organizations in Texas within its first year. Emma's academic background in social work combined with Richard's business expertise created programs that actually addressed root causes of poverty rather than just providing temporary relief. Richard found more satisfaction in this work than he had ever experienced in his business ventures, realizing that his daughter had indeed reminded him of the person he had wanted to become. Victoria's divorce settlement was ultimately much smaller than she had demanded, as the court found that her premeditated cruelty toward Emma had contributed significantly to the marriage's dissolution. She left Dallas society and moved to Los Angeles, where her story was less well known and she could attempt to rebuild her social standing. She never publicly apologized to Emma, maintaining that her actions had been justified given Richard's deception. The wedding venue where the infamous cake incident occurred became an unlikely tourist attraction, with social media influencers posing at the spot where Emma had been humiliated and ultimately vindicated. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice and the power of grace under pressure, shared in business schools and ethics classes as an example of how character reveals itself under stress. As we reach the end of this extraordinary story, I want you to think about the moment when Victoria Sterling saw Emma Martinez watching her wedding. Put yourself in Victoria's position for just a second. You've planned what you think is the perfect wedding, spent months crafting your image as the ideal billionaire's wife, and then you see someone who doesn't fit your carefully curated world. How would you have reacted? Would you have been curious about who this person was and why they were there? Or would you have felt threatened by their presence just as Victoria did? Now imagine you're Emma, a young woman who lost her mother 6 months earlier, attending a wedding to observe wealth inequality for your graduate thesis. You're trying to be invisible, sitting quietly in the back, when suddenly the bride marches across the room and humiliates you in front of hundreds of people and countless cameras. In that moment, when cake is dripping from your face and everyone is staring, do you think you would have had the courage to speak your truth the way Emma did? Could you have maintained your dignity when someone was trying to destroy it? The most haunting aspect of this story is how one moment of cruelty revealed so much about everyone involved. Victoria's attack on Emma exposed her insecurity, her prejudices, and ultimately her lack of basic human decency. Richard's reaction revealed his guilt, his longing for connection with his daughter, and his willingness to change when confronted with his failures. Emma's response showed her strength, her compassion, and her refusal to be diminished by someone else's hatred. What strikes me most about this story is how Emma could have used her father's wealth and status to get revenge on Victoria, but she chose a different path. She could have embraced the billionaire lifestyle and become everything Victoria had wanted to be, but instead she used her newfound platform to help others. Do you think you would have made the same choice? When someone hurts you publicly and humiliatingly, is your first instinct to fight back or to find a way to turn that pain into something positive? I also think about the 300 wedding guests who witnessed that cake-smearing incident. How many of them knew it was wrong but said nothing? How many laughed along with Victoria or took photos instead of intervening? In our social media age, when we can broadcast cruelty instantly to millions of people, what's our responsibility when we witness someone being humiliated? Are we complicit if we watch and do nothing? This story raises uncomfortable questions about how we judge people based on their appearance, their social status, and their ability to fit into our predetermined ideas of who belongs where. Emma Martinez belonged at that wedding more than anyone else in the room. She was the groom's daughter. But because she didn't look like she belonged, because she couldn't afford the right clothes or accessories, Victoria felt justified in treating her as less than human. What do you think? Did Victoria deserve what happened to her marriage, or was she just a victim of circumstances beyond her control? Did Richard do the right thing by choosing his daughter over his new wife, or should he have tried to find a way to honor both relationships? And what about Emma? Do you think she was truly as gracious as she appeared, or was there a part of her that enjoyed watching Victoria's world collapse? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like this force us to examine our own biases and ask ourselves how we would behave when our character is truly tested. Would we be the person who attacks someone different from us? The person who stands by and watches it happen? Or the person who finds a way to respond to cruelty with dignity and strength? If you found this story as compelling as I did, make sure to subscribe, because next week we're exploring another wedding disaster that exposed family secrets, this time involving a groom who discovered his bride's shocking connection to his own past. Until then, remember that our actions in moments of crisis reveal who we really are. Make sure you're someone you can be proud of.